Welcome to this IB Physics Option A review. First, we'll start with the eye. The principal axis leads us from the front of the eye to the retina. The retina is the surface which contains cones and rods and is sensitive to light. It converts light signals into electrical signals. The electrical signals are carried by the optic nerve to the brain, and the optic nerve forms a break or blind spot where the retinal surface is broken. Right behind the principal axis is the fovea. It's a particular location on the retina where there are tons and tons of cones and very few rods. The lens is what we use to focus images on the retina, and the ciliary muscle, along with the ciliary fibers, work to change the shape of the lens. The ciliary muscles can be contracted, in which case they expand and they're quite thick, or they can be relaxed, in which case they're pulled back and not very thick, kind of thin. When the muscles are contracted, there's less tension in the fibers, and that causes the lens to kind of bunch up. When the ciliary muscle is relaxed, the fibers are pulled tight, and the lens is thinned out. So from a side view, here's that thick lens when the ciliary muscle is contracted, and here's the thinner lens when the muscle is relaxed. Accommodation is the ability of the eye to change the shape of the lens in order to focus images on the retina of objects that are different distances from the eye. It allows us to shift between the near point, which is roughly 25 centimeters, and the far point, which is effectively infinity. We use a thick lens, like we said, for near vision, and a thin lens for far vision. Accommodation is achieved by having the ciliary muscles change the shape of the lens. And again, like we said before, if they ask this question, you'd want to mention that a thinner lens is used to focus an image of an object that's far away from the eye. A thicker lens would be used to focus an image of an object that's close to the eye. There are rods and cones. These are the two light-sensitive cells, or photoreceptors, on the retina. Rods are for scotopic vision. Cells are for photopic, like photocolor, color photos. Rods are for black and white vision. Cones are for colors. Rods are used when the light is not very bright, low intensity. Cones are used when it's really bright, high intensity light. Rods detect motion, and they also are responsible for peripheral vision, whereas cones are responsible for seeing fine details, which we call visual acuity. If we take the principal axis and move different angles, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, away from the principal axis, we see that the density of rods and cones changes. At 0 degrees, right on the principal axis, there are lots of cones and no rods. At about 25 degrees or 20 degrees, right here, there are many, many, many rods and no cones, virtually no cones. The cones are responsive to different colors, and there are three types of cones. Blue cones or long cones, blue cones or short cones, because they absorb short wavelengths. Green cones, which absorb medium wavelengths, and red cones, which absorb red wavelengths. The cones absorb overlapping colors. Reds and green cones absorb a lot of the same colors. These graphs show how much absorption there is of the various colors by the three main types of cones. Here's that same graph, and what we see are not only the cones, but this dotted line here represents what rods absorb. Now, both of the graphs I've just shown you do not scale appropriately up and down. Here's what it looks like when we scale for the sensitivity of rods and cones. The rods are far more sensitive, so the y-axis is higher, cones are less sensitive. This is the resultant graph for all three cones. If we wanted, we could try to sort of break up that resultant graph into the blue cone sensitivity, the green cone sensitivity, and the red cone sensitivity, and it looks like this. The primary colors of light are red, green, and blue. The secondary colors are magenta, yellow, and cyan. The secondary colors are each secondary color is formed by mixing two primary colors. So let's say we have an object which appears magenta in white light. What color does the object appear under yellow light? Here's the object. We have to figure out first what it absorbs. White light comes in, which is a mix of red, green, and blue in even proportions. The object under white light appears magenta. That means red and blue is reflected. Objects appear the colors that they reflect. Therefore, green must be absorbed by this object because the green's not reflected. So let's take the same object, which absorbs green, and view it under yellow light, which is red plus green. The green is absorbed, and only red is reflected, so the object looks red. Color subtraction refers to color filters. For example, if we're asked to explain what a red filter does in terms of color subtraction, this is easy. A red filter subtracts the other colors, green and blue, from white light. It only transmits red. Different things impact our perception. Perception is different from vision. Perception is how things seem to us. Shadows impact our perception of color. Is the dress white and gold, or is it black and blue? Well, it depends on whether you think the colors are in a shadow, in which case you'll see white and gold, or if they're not in enough light, or if they're being flooded with light, in which case you'll correct the color to black and blue. Likewise, shadows can make an object look massive. White, we know, is an equal combination, or roughly equal combination, of red, green, and blue. Warm white has a little bit more red. That's what we see on the left. Cool white has some more blue. So the hue, or the tint of light, can impact whether it appears warm or cold. Likewise, the color of ceilings can make something look different. Dark ceilings make a room look smaller. Maybe you could think of it as cozy. Light ceilings make a room look more vast. It makes a room look deeper. So here's a room with a black ceiling. It looks small, kind of shallow, not very deep. And this white ceiling makes this room look vast, much deeper. Explain how a standing wave is formed. This question might be asked, or it might say, explain the formation of a standing wave. Whenever there's an incident wave in a medium, which superposes and interferes with a reflected wave, a standing wave is formed at certain frequencies where the boundary conditions are met. Here's a string which is being caused to vibrate at the first 4 standing wave frequencies. Here we could show one wavelength is one complete cycle. A wavelength is just the length of one cycle. In the third case that we showed, the wavelength is this. Here's the second wavelength, one complete cycle, goes up, down, and then back. And we can't even see one wavelength in this picture. We have to extend out our drawing, and then we can measure one wavelength. The equation for the nth lambda, and this is something to memorize, is 2 times the string length over n. If you want lambda 1, you put a 1 right here and a 1 right here, and you plug in the length L of the string. Frequency we can find using the wave speed equation. C, the wave speed, is frequency times lambda. Solve for frequency and plug in values to find the value of frequency. In general, the nth frequency is equal to that number times f1, which is also called the fundamental frequency. So F1 is the fundamental frequency, and the nth frequency, F2, F3, F4, is just equal to 2 or 3 or 4 times the fundamental. For example, if the fundamental frequency is 25 Hz, then the second harmonic frequency, or the second standing wave frequency, is twice that, 50. The third is 3 times the fundamental, 75. And the fourth is 4 times the fundamental, 100. When a pipe is open at both ends, we have different waves that can form, standing waves, as compared to a pipe closed at one end. In the left case, we can produce the first 3 harmonics. In the right case, we only produce odd harmonics, whereas on the left we can produce all harmonics, odd and even. So all frequencies, all integers of the fundamental are produced on the left side. Only odd integers of the fundamental are produced on the right side. Those frequency values we can find using the wave speed equation. And like before, each frequency, F2, F3, or F3, F5, is just that harmonic number, n, times the fundamental. In the left case, we have the same equation as for strings. Here's the equation that you want to memorize for finding the wavelength, the nth wavelength. On the right case, here's the different equation when a pipe is closed at one end. We have to use this equation to find the nth wavelength. And again, we can only produce odd harmonics for a pipe closed at one end, whereas we produce all odd and even harmonics for a pipe open at both ends. Forming a standing wave is an example of resonance. For example, with pipes, the air in a pipe is being forced to vibrate at one of those natural harmonic frequencies, F1, F2, F3, and so forth. Those frequencies are natural frequencies. And when you force the air to vibrate at the natural frequency, you have resonance. A loud noise is produced. That means big amplitudes. So this is why it's loud when you sing into a Coca-Cola bottle at just the right frequency. The air undergoes resonance, and this means that there are big amplitudes, high intensity, and a loud sound. Standing waves and progressive waves are different. Standing waves don't propagate energy, whereas progressive waves, or traveling waves, do. This should say energy is propagated. Standing waves can only be produced at certain frequencies. That's not the case for progressive waves. Standing waves have nodes and antinodes. That's not true for progressive waves. There are no positions on progressive waves that are always at zero displacement. In standing waves, particles have amplitude which depends on the location. Some particles, those at a node, have zero amplitude because they never go up or down. In a progressive wave, every particle always has the same amplitude of oscillation. The Doppler effect is the change in frequency received by an observer due to relative motion between the source of the wave and the observer. Whenever there's approach, the observed frequency is higher. Whenever there is receding away, the observed frequency is lower. For example, if a car is moving to the right, this observer, right here on the right, has the car approaching. So the frequency, the waves which strike, are much more frequent, and the frequency that the person observes is much higher. The person on the left, on the other hand, has the car receding away. The wavefronts that strike that person are much more spaced out, and so that person hears a lower frequency. Those wavefronts are less frequent. Approach produces a higher observed frequency because that observed wavelength on the right side, the distance between two wavefronts, that observed wavelength is shorter. Receding away produces a lower observed frequency on the left. The reason is because the observed wavelength, lambda prime, the distance between two wavefronts, is much longer on the left side. The same thing can be produced not when the source of waves is moving, but when the observer is moving.